Greetings sailors and welcome to a view replay courtesy of Gidzeki this time in the Duke of York, or HMS Dork as I've tried to christen it, but I'm not sure that's going to stick. So Gidzeki is a name you might recognise from a recent-ish Jingles video. He actually sent that one to me as well, but Jingles was just that much quicker at looking at it and getting it put up on his channel, and at that point, well, there's really not much point to me doing it as well. But Gidzeki also sent me this. Now this is from towards the end of the Duke of York campaign, so there were a fair few of them around. And the Duke of York, for those of you who've been completely living under a rock, is basically a King George V, but with a lower rate of fire and a much better mid-range AA suite. It's actually got, I think, some of the best mid-range AA at tier 7, if not the best mid-range AA at tier 7. But because it's mid-range AA, because the smaller AA mounts do not have the durability of the dual-purpose secondary mounts, that AA tends to get knocked out a lot more easily. So you might start off with hundreds of DPS at the start of a match, but by the time you've gone through to the end of the match, well, the cruiser and often battleship HE spam will mean that you've probably not got a lot of that left remaining. So he's in a division with was it Charlie London there? I couldn't quite catch the name, or something like that. In another Duke of York, there's also another Duke of York on their team, and the enemy team has 2 as well. So theoretically, there ought to be a fair bit of HE spam flying around, because of course this does have the same shells as the KGV. And it's just that it fires a bit slower. So yeah, if you meet one of these things, you can fully expect it to be firing HE the same as a KGV. But this is almost the remarkable thing about this replay. I mean, it's going to be an okay battleship game. In fact, it's going to be a rather decent battleship game. But it's the fact that Gidzeki does not once, throughout this entire thing, fire any HE whatsoever. Now, he's had a little bit of a bump with this key, and we get to hear what the various horns sound like, and I'm not sure calling this key player an idiot was entirely necessary. I think it was just an honest mistake on both their parts, which, you know, does happen sometimes. But I don't know. I don't know what stage of the evening this was for Gidzeki and Charlie London here. It might have been after multiple games where they endured lots of terrible teammates, at which point, you know, your temper tends to be maybe a little bit on more of a short fuse than it would otherwise. I occasionally, even when I'm streaming warships, you know, I've been known to say the odd naughty word or two. Most recently, when I think it was like the very first game of a stream, and I basically got torpedoed for half of my health by an air quotes friendly hipper, which was just a completely unnecessary drop, and it went on to be an okay game otherwise. But the hipper did not once apologise, didn't try and warn me they were in the water. No, they just put out torpedoes against something that I don't even think they had the range to put torpedoes out against, and so therefore the only thing that was in danger was me. So yeah, that slightly pushed my buttons a little bit. So these things do happen. They do happen. Accidents do happen, but sometimes it's just sheer idiocy that happens as well. But I don't think that was the case with that little collision. So because of that, and because he kind of slowed at the start to try and get shots across the middle, he's found himself in a bit of an awkward position, because I think he wanted to head towards the A cap along with Charlie London, except he's tarried long enough that actually enemy ships are now starting to poke around the middle with maybe the intent of getting into the C cap, and so he's had to change his plans a bit. He's having to now stick around the C cap in order to prevent that from happening. And it also looks like there might be ships pushing along from the D cap as well, because his team is outnumbered on that side. Now, the enemy team did start with 1 more destroyer in this one, I should point that out, and they've lost one of their destroyers already, so that's a pretty big disadvantage on a domination map. And just even starting off with 1 less destroyer, unless, you know, the enemy team gets a you know, the extra destroyer is like a Soviet destroyer that can be seen from space, that kind of thing. You know, it's not necessarily always as bad as it seems on paper, but in this case, yeah, them not having that extra destroyer is turning out to be a really big problem, because the surviving destroyer, the Kagero, is kind of stuck over on the 10 line, and so they don't really have much to push the A cap with, even though they have a fair few ships over there. Meanwhile, the enemy team has 2 destroyers there and still has a destroyer over at the D cap as well. So the enemy carrier has noticed that he is basically alone. Everything else is kind of clumped up together at the moment. You know, the Tirpitz and the Cleveland were probably not an attractive target particularly. The Key's definitely not an attractive target. Charlie London might have been slightly so, but he would have been within the AA range of the Key potentially. So instead the carrier decided to try their luck with Gidzeki, and it didn't really work out because he's still got basically all of his AA. Now, if you're wondering about the AA range, I don't have it turned on for this particular the minimap circle indicator. I do for most ships, but it's about the same as the hydro range. So in this case, I just left on the hydro range rather than have extra circles cluttering up the thing. So I don't think he's got AFT. I don't think he's particularly got an AA, set up on this ship. But even so, with that short-range AA, it can be quite deadly, but it tends to be more deadly against, dive bombers and things coming for you. And it's still long-range enough that it will eat a few torpedo bombers as well, but unless you particularly add range to it, it's not going to be that big of a threat to carriers overall. It's a tier 7 carrier in a tier 7 game, so this is pretty good matchmaking in terms of having your AA be effective in a Duke of York. But that's not always going to be the case, of course. If a tier 8, tier 9 carrier comes for you, the AA is just not going to be quite as good. So there's one of the enemy destroyers, a Gallant, who decided to come through the middle and try their hand at capping, maybe not realizing that Gidzeki was here, but he is definitely still here, and he's actually had to move more towards the D-cap just because of the manoeuvring he had to do with the carrier. So scratch one destroyer, and one of the other enemy destroyers has died already as well. So that just leaves a Lo Yang. But that Lo Yang has 3 kills, so that Lo Yang does appear to know what they are doing. And 3 kills with, well, I'm assuming the torpedoes. They are fairly slow torpedoes, but they're still decent torps. It's not that easy. But, it's still possible. But they might have gunned things down as well. In fact, having said that, it's 4 kills now. So yeah, that Lo Yang on the enemy team is definitely a decent player. We have to watch out for them. So, I mean, they've kept and held the C cap, I think, partly because of Gidzeki. If he hadn't been here, certainly some of those enemy ships, like the Edinburgh, for instance, or one of the battleships that we saw earlier, might have tried their luck with capping. And there was a Tirpitz nearby, but that's now much more over towards the D cap, where they're also now capping. The A cap, though, I mean, that's just not gone well at all. I think partly because the Lo Yang is there, partly because they were, without a destroyer of their own. And they did have an Atlanta, but their Atlanta didn't. I don't know. I mean, they must have radared at some point, but their Atlanta didn't seem to have been using it particularly effectively, or maybe they just got unlucky. But either way, the Atlanta wasn't, their own Atlanta wasn't a particularly good counter. And so, of all the things that went to the A cap, it's just that Leander that's left, and he's about to die to the carrier. So we've skipped on a little bit here, not too much further on. Gidzeki's only done about 41,000 damage so far. It's not like hugely impressive, but he is still a reasonably healthy battleship. And we've come down to there not being that many players on each team, but the enemy team does have quite a significant cap advantage. So the points lead is not insurmountable, but it's not, it's not a pretty situation. So the Amagi comes around the corner, eats 6 penetrations. You're not really going to citadel an Amagi with these guns unless you get somehow incredibly lucky. But I'm not quite sure why the Amagi isn't firing at him. He's had a completely broadside a Duke of York to fire at, and I don't know, he seemed to have missed his window of opportunity there, and now he's ignoring Gidzeki completely because there's also a Kutuzov here, and maybe it's just the Kutuzov seems like a squashier target, but anyway, this is basically allowing Gidzeki to straighten back up, use all of his turrets on this broadside Amagi, and he's still going to get penetrations. You know, at this close range, he's certainly not going to have any difficulty penetrating this Amagi's broadside, but he's certainly not going to have any massive, devastating citadel strikes because it's an Amagi and these are 14-inch guns. So that time was actually more aimed at kind of the upper belt / superstructure, and it wasn't quite so effective. He could do with some more of those first hits where he had, what was it, like 17k? Or am I completely misremembering? It was over 10k anyway. It was pretty respectable. And while the Kutuzov looks unlikely to survive, it also looks like this Amagi is going to go down as well, which is, you know, that's a rather tough enemy ship. Also, it must be a tier 8 game. Of course it's a tier 8 game if there's Amagis and things. Why did I think it was a tier 7 game? I don't know. They have Tirpitzes and Amagis. Of course it's a tier 8 game. Anyway, so the carrier's been paying him a little bit of attention, but it was also at the point where the carrier was getting taken down themselves pretty much. So these planes are now just circling overhead and are no longer a threat. Now, as the enemy Duke of York was coming round the corner, I think Gidzeki decided to pull back at that point, but I'm pretty sure the enemy Duke of York is more focused on their own carrier at the moment, who is not going to last too much longer, I don't think. They've been picked up by the Lo Yang, and with the Lo Yang and the Duke of York firing at them, yeah, that's a bad situation. However, that means that potentially, you know, it limits the number of ships that could be firing at Gidzeki and the surviving Tirpitz. So we've got a Genizer now somewhere to the west. Well, not somewhere to the west, he's actually spotted at the moment. And there's also a Duke of York, another Duke of York. And, well, of these, both of them are potentially a problem in different ways. The enemy Duke of York could just, of course, fire a lot of HE at him, and the Genizer now, if he gets in close, has torpedoes, so you don't really want that to happen. And heck, if the Genizer now guns behave, they are also dangerous guns, but it's the if they behave part that's pertinent there. But if you can cap unmolested, well, that is going to help slow the bleeding a little bit. There is still 200 plus points between the two teams, but of course it does rather rely on him not getting hit by the Genizer now, because the Tirpitz isn't in the cap circle at all, so if he gets reset, it's going to be rather annoying. It's going to cost them a lot of progress. So the Ranger actually took down, no it didn't, it was the Duke of York that got taken down by the Tirpitz. I was completely misreading that there, but it was the Ranger also going down at that moment, having survived a surprisingly long time, all things considered. So yeah, one of the Duke of Yorks is done, and the other one is now angling back up from the south, having assisted in killing the carrier. That was a Kraken for that Lo Yang, by the way. So yeah, this Lo Yang is certainly a decent player, and that's a pretty respectable result for that machine. So yeah, it's just now a case of not dying, trying to take down the Genizer now, maybe even trying to cap A, because there's still a good 5 minutes left in this. This is still winnable, potentially. It's not like we're in the last minute and there's just no way to close the points gap other than to kill everything. So he took a rather heavy hit there, or so it seemed. I'm not sure whether it was the Genizer now or the Duke of York. I think it was the Genizer now got like a close on 10k damage salvo into, well, it must have been either the superstructure or maybe he got some overmatches through the bow, but either way, you know, when you're at this kind of low health, those hits, even though it's not quite the same as a devastating broadside, they still hurt. And he's only now got the one heal left as well, so he needs a bit of time here before the Duke of York or the Lo Yang comes for him. But they're maybe more interested in trying to cap C first rather than trying to take him out. Although he is an attractively low health target at this point. You know, they do well to go for him if they can. Now, with having taken cap points and having killed the Genizer now, they've considerably narrowed the gap, and having killed the other enemy Duke of York as well, of course, the Turpits getting that was also a very useful kill. So really at this point, you know, Gidzeki's got to be sweating a little bit, and he's definitely wanting this Turpits to take the strain, because this Turpits is still relatively healthy. And ideally, the Turpits would be coming towards him on this side, really. But this is a bit of a sticky situation in some ways, because it's almost perfect for the Lo Yang in terms of setting up an ambush. If they try and push through the middle, it's going to give the Lo Yang a really great opportunity to just get a bunch of torpedoes in somebody's face. And Gidzeki has just been spotted, surface spotted, so we know the Lo Yang is somewhere along these middle passages. Now, if the Turpits has any kind of plane available, this would be the time to put it up, and actually that's what Gidzeki is counselling there, but we don't know the status. The Turpits is not communicating at all. They maybe don't speak English, but for whatever reason, you know, they're not even using the hot wheel commands. I can't think of the... I don't know, there's probably some other name for that that's like less clunky, but anyway. So as it is, Gidzeki is facing this Duke of York alone, and with that salvo, that's put him over 100,000, or was it already over 100,000? But it's put him in the position of getting a Confederate medal anyway, so he's damaged a fair number of the enemy team at this point, basically. So the Turpits has pushed around on the other side. It means they can fire at this Duke of York from both sides, basically. And Gidzeki really has to be a bit worried at this point, because this guy is firing HE at him, and a good HE salvo could maybe end him. But as it is, the Turpits lands a pretty decent hit through the aft armour, which again must have been overmatching Pens, because you can do that with the Turpits guns. The 15-inch guns against tier 7s. I think almost all the tier 7s can overmatch each other's bow armour. I think the KGV and the Duke of York are the only ones that can't, but they can still overmatch the bow armour of lower tier ships, though. So that leaves Gidzeki free to cap, and it just catches sight of the Lo Yang. Actually, it will be the Turpits that caught sight of the Lo Yang at this range. But as it's going to turn out, yeah, I mean, he put out the Hydro on the premise that the Lo Yang might be nearby, but it's running out just as the Lo Yang actually does turn up. However, well, even though the Lo Yang tries to smoke in a valiant attempt to turn this around, as it is, Gidzeki does manage to correctly predict that final shot and gets the final kill for his own Kraken. This was a double Kraken game. It's not often you see that, a Kraken on each team. So yeah, both of these players did rather well for themselves. But as it was one of the enemy Duke of Yorks that actually topped the team list. You'd think it was the Lo Yang with 5 kills, but some of those must have been very low health kills. So yeah, still 1500 base XP for that enemy Lo Yang. That was all right. So 115k, almost 116k, and it was all AP. He did get a bit of damage out of his secondary batteries, but yeah, as far as his main batteries go, it just goes to show that the 14-inch AP on these guns is still viable, definitely. But there are times when you're still maybe going to fall to temptation and load that HE anyway, especially against higher tier angled battleships. If you find yourself in a tier 9 game and there's just lots of bow tanking Iowas, then yeah, I mean, you could try and be good and virtuous and go for the superstructure AP shots, but at that point, if you're going for the superstructure, you might as well load the HE and do it and get a bunch of fires on top, because that's just the nature of the majority of British battleships in the game at the moment. It's not all of them, but it is the majority of them, and it's definitely something that needs to be fixed. Also, I should note, perhaps, that Gidzeki had on his team the most air kills of anybody, 29 air kills. So yeah, it just goes to show this AA. It's pretty good, it's decent, but you know, by the end of the game, he definitely won't have had nearly as much DPS left. So it's one of those things where it's diminishing returns. The AA power just decreases such over the course of a game that you'll often see smart carrier players avoiding ships like that to begin with, and then waiting until they've been hit with cruiser HE spam a bit, and then going in for the kill later on. But as it was, that enemy carrier didn't try and do that at all. So hopefully you've enjoyed this replay, and if you have, you can leave any comments below, you can hit the like button, you can sub to my channel if you haven't already, and as always, stay tuned for more.